Hello, everybody, and welcome back to my channel, or welcome back to my podcast for those of you who are listening to this episode in the audio version only. My name is Rux. I'm a Western tropical astrologer, and today is a historic day, folks, for my channel, for my podcast. Why is that? Well, because we have a guest today, fellow astrologer Anastasia. Anastasia is a Hellenistic astrologer based in New York. The last time, in case you're wondering, the last time we had a guest on Written in the Stars by Rux was in 2021, which feels like a lifetime ago.
I feel special.
You absolutely are. And I'm very excited to have you here, Anastasia. And thank you for accepting my invite. We connected via social media, Instagram, and we hit it off straight away. And I do believe that's also because we have some interesting kind of like common placements or almost common placements in our charts. So we've got some good synastry going on there, but you'll see that for yourselves. So Anastasia is a Hellenistic astrologer who works with clients on a one-to-one basis, just like I do. And you may also know her. If you don't, do go ahead and follow her. You may know her from Instagram. Her handle is Anastasia Does Astrology. And I believe that is the same name that you're using also on YouTube and on TikTok. Am I right?
Yeah, that's the
Fantastic.
Same name.
So Anastasia, I'm going to kind of like pass it on to you. Could you please tell us a little bit about yourself, about how you got started on your astrological journey? And before you do that, the juiciest part, what are your big three placements? Tell us everything.
It's kind of like astrology introduction, right? Do you need to know a person's name, or do you just need to know their big three? What's more important? So I'm a Libra rising, Gemini moon, and Virgo sun in the 12th house. So today we're talking about karmic houses, and I have some energy in that karmic house, which is why that topic is very interesting for me. Thank you for the warm introduction. Thank you for having me on your channel. I'm super excited. I have always been interested in astrology. I'm from Russia originally, and my entire family was always like, oh, you're such a Virgo. Oh, you're such a Gemini. It was always on a very shallow level. But then a few years back, my dad passed away. So I had a very tough experience, and I kind of leaned into it as a source of comfort, as I think many of us end up finding our way to astrology through looking for answers when the life is unable to give you some. So I started diving into my chart, found out that my moon is in Gemini, which was very, very like interesting to me, because I was always like, oh, Geminis. And now I totally,
I know. What is it with, like, I feel like Geminis and Scorpios, they get like so much unnecessary hate because there's so many misconceptions around them, I think. I mean, maybe that's just me, or maybe that's, I don't know, like social media just kind of like tossing the dirt at them. But hey, like I've got Mars in Gemini. I love Gemini. I'm like, yeah, go.
Did you have a placement like that you found out and you like used to dislike it, and now you realize that you have it?
You're gonna laugh, but shallow me, before actually studying astrology, maybe as kind of like a teenager and so on, did probably associate Leos with kind of like big ego energy. And I was a little bit kind of like rolling my eyes. I'm like, the drama. And then I find out that I have Jupiter in Leo and in place in my second house of self-worth. I'm like, oh my gosh, what does that mean? It means that I'm a bit of a Leo myself. So it was a bit of a wake-up call, but that's why I love astrology, because I feel like one of the greatest things that I've learned from it is that there's so many positive and good stuff about like all signs, and we're all a little bit of everything. We're kind of like a mix, a combination of all signs. Of course, we all have all 12 zodiac signs in our chart.
Right.
So no judging other signs. Like we love to judge, but like, hey, you might be surprised, person out there listening to this, if you're kind of like hating on Taurus, for instance. It's like, maybe you've got something over there. So
yeah, yes, for sure. And it rules your midheaven, so it rules your house of career. So Jupiter is not just hanging out in your second house, it's responsible for a lot of things.
it's true, it's true. I've got my midheaven in Pisces, so yeah, spot on.
Yeah, no judgment thing, I totally agree with as well. Like, you have every sign somewhere in your chart, so if you're hating on something, you're hating on part of yourself. So be careful, don't hate.
That's the message of today's video, folks. Okay, we can now wrap it up. No, I'm obviously joking.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that with us, Anastasia. Thank you for kind of like sharing a little bit about your journey astrologically. It's so interesting that indeed we do go to astrology to find comfort. I feel like when astrology found me, because that's what I always like to say, I was kind of like still healing, in a process of healing from my parents' divorce, which was probably one of the most challenging events of my life, now looking back at it. And I discovered astrology through a colleague who became my teacher, my mentor, someone who I used to work with back home in Romania, and she became my teacher. Laura, if you're watching this, kudos to you. She became my teacher.
Thank you, Laura, for bringing rocks into the world of astrology.
Oh, my days, yes. If it hadn't been for her, who knows how much longer it would have taken me to discover it. And she was
like a midwife. She assisted your
think so. She pushed me through that astrological birth canal. Yes. And so much made sense. In terms of kind of like understanding my parents' motivations, where they were coming from, like what happened at the time of their divorce. Alas, Saturn was transiting my fourth house of home, family, roots, and the past. There you have it. So speaking of the fourth house, I'm going to kind of like share a little bit of what we're going to dive into today. So you've seen already the headline of today's episode. We're talking today about the 3 karmic houses in astrology, the triad of karmic houses: the 4th house, the 8th house in the natal chart, and the 12th house. We're going to explain why they are connected with karma, maybe a little bit more, why it may feel like they're connected a little bit more with karma than the other houses in our natal charts. But let me not jump the gun and start by sharing what is a house? What is a house, and what are we actually even talking about? So for those of you who are newer to astrology, what we're talking about today is 3 houses, 3 karmic houses in your natal chart, in your birth chart. The birth chart is the map of the sky at the time when you were born. It's the blueprint of the sky at the time when you were born. Each birth chart has 12 sections, which are called houses. If you're going to see what your natal chart looks like, which I highly recommend, and I'll explain how to generate that, you're going to see that it looks like a circle divided into 12 slices, 12 sections. Each slice is a house, and each house is associated with specific life sectors, areas of life experience. For instance, the first house is the house of the physical body, of new beginnings, of how you approach reality, of your style, of your looks. It is associated with the self, with personality. The second house is the house of income, values, self-worth, self-esteem, and so on. So if you want to generate your natal chart, there is a lot of resources online. You can go to astro.com or to alabi.com/free chart. You put in your date, time, and place of birth, and do ask your parents, ask your mom, ask your aunts, your uncles, your time of birth, because that's super important. And by doing this, you're going to get a graphic depiction of your natal chart, and you're going to see what on earth we're talking about when we're mentioning the 4th house, the 8th house in your natal chart, and the 12th house.
You definitely have it. Some people are like, I don't have anything. I don't have a 4th house. You have it somewhere in your chart. You'll find it.
I think, yes, Anastasia, you've hit the nail on the head. Sometimes I also get comments like this, and I think it's important to remember that everyone has 12 houses. Like you cannot not have a 4th house or an 8th house, and so on. Both Anastasia and myself, please correct me if I'm wrong. Please correct me if I'm wrong. We use the whole sign house system.
We do.
So in the whole sign house system, the sign of your ascendant, let's say you have a Libra rising, like Anastasia, the sign of your ascendant will have rulership over your entire 1st house. Your 2nd house will be governed by Scorpio, your 3rd house by Sagittarius, your 4th house by Capricorn, by the sign of Capricorn, and so on, essentially in the order of signs. I know a lot of people work with Placidus, with the Placidus house system, maybe also because it is the default house system. You don't have to kind of like change the settings, like play around with them. Yeah. But whole sign is actually the oldest in Western astrology. If I'm not mistaken, and I do believe I'm quoting Chris Brennan here, it was used almost exclusively for the first 1,000 years of Western astrology in practice. So our preference is whole sign, but you go ahead and do your own thing. Like work with whatever feels good for you.
Yeah, whatever resonates.
That's what I say. Their house systems are like languages in my view. And if you look at your natal chart at the end of the day through the lens of whatever house system, you may find that the same story or the same theme in the chart stands out through maybe different placements that kind of like point towards a similar thread. So I hope that maybe clarifies a little bit the thorny issue of house systems, because it's always like this big debate.
I think you're a natural teacher, so if you guys are not studying with Roxia, she's teaching transit class, right? Is coming up.
That's true. That's true.
Sign up.
Thank you for the shout out. Indeed, I'm running in May an astrological forecasting with transits course. It is a course for astrology students or practitioners that already have a kind of like foundational understanding of astrology, of natal chart interpretation in particular. So yes, in case you haven't signed up, you can find the link in the description box. Thank you, Anastasia.
I think it's just like, when you were talking about slices, I was imagining a piece of pie, and it just made me, I was like, what a great analogy. Anyone can understand it. Yeah. I
mean, Cancer rising after all, right?
Yes. Yeah. My story, I have a friend and he kept on not telling me his birth time. And I kept on guessing because he's obsessed with food. He just like, all he thinks about his life is just attached to what to eat, where to eat it, what to cook, how to lose weight. And I was like, so I kept on thinking he must be a Taurus rising. Turns out he's not, but he's a Cancer rising. And I was like, how would I not think that he can be a Cancer rising? But yeah.
It's all about food. Like ultimately, it's like one of the best things.
Isn't it? Isn't the whole life kind of?
It is. Coming from someone who does not know how to cook at all. I cook nothing. Like I cook nothing, but I love to eat. Like food is life. Food is well, technically it actually is. So yeah. Shall we dive into this very important topic in astrology, I believe. In general, I don't know how your experience has been so far, Anastasia, in your practice, but I do feel like a lot of people consult an astrologer many times about topics connected with these 3 houses. there's a lot that hinges on topics connected with these three houses, because let's face it, they do feel more challenging in general. Maybe it feels like we haven't had a say in the things that have unfolded in our lives in these particular life sectors. So do you want to kind of like dive right into the fourth house?
Sure. And also why we're talking about these houses, right? Kind of like how are they connected to karma, real quick. Fourth house is the foundation of things. Fourth house is at the bottom of your chart. It's kind of the roots of your chart. So it has to do with your family. It has to do with your early life, with your childhood. And things that happen to us in our childhood are out of our control. Speaking of things that, you know, kind of happen in our life that are not in our control. And then we're going to talk about eighth house, which is all the resources of other people, all the things that we also have no control over. Are they going to give it to us? Are they not going to give it to us? When are they going to take it? Our body as a resource, you know, when is it going to give out on us? And then 12th house is literally things that we like lose and go through, and kind of like challenging things, just briefly. So yeah, like, so they definitely have to do with our karma, as in our early conditioning, and then how we deal with that and how we interact with other people, right, based on the early conditioning. And then 12th house is like, do we work with it, or do we go towards a more negative tendencies of the 12th house? Yeah, so fourth house deals with things that are unseen. It's an angular house, so it's quite a significant house. And it holds people as our parents, right? So the tendencies our parents had, the habits, the relationship dynamics they had, how they treated us. Were they supportive or not supportive? And then, you know, how did we process it? Do we take it and we repeat it in our family, or do we like go and create something different, right? Like, do we try to do the opposite? Yeah, childhood, I think, is a big, right, like big part of the fourth house. The type of environment you grew up in, the experiences you had. Do you want to add to it? What do you?
I would add a few things. Yes, like yes to everything that you've mentioned so far, Anastasia. I would also link the fourth house with our sense of security and stability in our private life. So in order to go out into the world to do whatever it is that we need to do, well, first and foremost, we have to have strong roots. We have to have a home to come back to. We have to feel like we belong. We have to feel a sense of connection with the past, with our ancestors, with not just with our family of origin, but maybe kind of like going down the ancestral route. The fourth house can also connect us with our country of origin, let's say. And as well, we're both immigrants, so you live in the United States, I've been living in the United Kingdom for it's going to be 8 years this July. It's also how we feel about,
for me.
There you have it. So it's like, what is that, like half of your life, pretty much. So it's also how we connect with the places that we come from. If we look in general at the signs that govern, or that kind of like cover the fourth house, I can share a little bit of my experience and what I've noticed many times in consultations and studying charts. The sign in the fourth house tells us a lot about the general kind of like energies and like atmosphere in the home that you had to deal with. So for instance, my fourth house is ruled by Libra, and alas, My mother is a Libra rising. My grandmother is a Libra sun. And if I kind of like dig a little bit deeper into that, I'm sure I'm going to find some more Libras in the family tree. I've got some aunts who have like Libra placements and so on. I believe that what I inherited from that from my personal kind of like history with this sign on the cusp of my fourth house is maybe a strong kind of like sense of fairness when I go out into the world. I remember my mom always being preoccupied in a way with kind of like not bothering people or not wasting their time or not making them feel like they're not listening, they haven't been kind of like heard, that we aren't listening to them. If I went to my mom with like something that was going on at school and said, look, this kid told me this, like I'm so upset, I'm angry or whatever, she'd be like, yes, but you have to put yourself into their shoes, like where are they coming from, what's happening in their life, think about their background. I'm like, oh my God, like how does that even work? Like, where is that coming from? This is coming from someone who has no planets in the fourth house. Generally, planets placed in the fourth house, they do have a very private quality. So it's something, it's an energy that maybe we connect with more at home. It's an energy that we keep to ourselves. I don't have any planets in the fourth house, Anastasia, but I know you do. So maybe you can share a little bit about your own experience.
Wanted to add to Libra on your fourth house, in your fourth house, and just look at your background. Look at what's behind you. There's a guitar, there are flowers, there is like beautifully looking, there is like a golden skull. Is that a skull? It is a skull. So yeah, so Libra, right? Like your environment is beautiful and aesthetically pleasing too. So I can see that as well. My fourth house is Capricorn, and I had to be a grown-up in my family. So as a Capricorn fourth house, maybe people who are listening and watching, if you have Capricorn or Aquarius in your fourth house, you might feel similar vibes. Like there's a lot of seriousness. There's a need to be, I was an only child. A lot of my childhood was spent traveling and like meeting new people. So there was kind of an introduction to being a grown-up early on. And I do have Neptune in the fourth house, and Neptune in the fourth is not like the easiest placement because it could mean that it could be a few things, right? As always, that's why it's like, it depends on the maturity of your parents. It could mean parents who are highly spiritual, highly creative, people who are idealistic. It could also mean people who have addiction issues, and that has been a story in my childhood, like in my family. So definitely certain karma connected to that, and the whole concept of being an adult as a kid, like having to deal with serious issues, is definitely something that is, you know, in me and I'm carrying with me. So that's where I think fourth house, we didn't mention, it's also like property, right? Like homeland property.
It's true. Yeah.
But it's also what you said about comfort. It's also your emotional baseline. But it's so interesting too, when you were talking about your mom, makes me also think of your Mars in the 12th house, as two people who share Mars in the 12th house, right? Like when your parent is like, don't feel angry because you must understand them. And you're like, what? But what am I supposed to do with these feelings of anger, right?
My anger, where would I put it?
Right, in the 12th house, clearly.
Shove it. Yeah, that's
so
true.
Yeah, so then later you have to figure out how to deal with it. So yeah, it's like our inheritance in some ways, which is also 8th house, but it's also like, you know, how do you deal with fighting? Did your parents fight a lot and you couldn't fight? Did no one ever express anger and now you're not expressing anger? It's like you were a kid, right? Things happened in your life, you absorbed it, and now as a grown-up, you have a role to play. Like you have more control over it, right? Like you want to talk about like dealing with these placements. It's not always like, yes, it was imprinted on you, but it's not determining your entire life, right? Like Neptune is in my 4th house. It's not in my 1st house. I am not Neptune. So I can use this energy and like process it and choose to be maybe a very spiritual person in my home, right? Create, like put an altar in my home. Do you have a lot of clients who have planets in the 4th house? How do you see it usually manifest?
In my experience, folks who have stelliums in the 4th house, or maybe the ruler of their chart in the 4th house, the first impression that I get from them is that they keep a lot to themselves. There's also a lot going on literally at home, in their private, in their personal life. There's a lot of stories around family, around like property, around moving, and all of that. It obviously depends on, for instance, like what planets in the 4th house, what other houses they rule in your chart. So let's say you have the ruler of the 7th house of relationships placed in the 4th house of home. It's possible maybe that your marriage partner in this lifetime will be someone who you met in childhood, or will be someone who you were introduced to via a parent or via a family member. So it may feel like a lot in your life is tied to where you come from, your family, your roots, your residence, and so on. I think you started talking about something that I believe is invaluable in astrology, which is how to work constructively with any placements that we have in the natal chart, but especially with the more challenging ones, such as Neptune in the 4th house, maybe Uranus in the 4th house, Saturn there, Pluto there as well, maybe Mars. So I do believe that we have, as co-creators of our reality, we have a say, maybe a partial say. Now we're getting into the whole free will. How much is it free will? How much is it choice in our life? We have, to an extent, a say in how we channel, how we utilize the cards that we have been dealt. So of course, we can't change the past. We can't change the family that we were born into. Alas, karma, they say that our soul chose our family, chose certain challenges for us to learn certain lessons, to kind of like evolve in one form or another. But we can also consciously tune into that energy. And like you said, Anastasia, with Neptune in the 4th house, maybe choose to have like a spiritual kind of like a home environment where you meditate at home, or your home could be your escape bubble. Of course, with Neptune in the 4th house, correct me if I'm wrong, is it possible that you might have also felt like there were instances where you were kind of like required to sacrifice part of like your life experience because of what was going on with your family? So I'm thinking you moved a lot, maybe you had to leave behind friends, a school, a setup in which you were very comfortable. I'm also thinking, for instance, of Saturn in the 4th house. If you have Saturn in the 4th house, in many cases, I have seen instances where there was either a lack of resources, of tangible material resources. There was a sense of like, we don't have enough money, enough, enough maybe emotional support, possibly, depending upon the sign. The home environment might have been an environment where you had to work from a young age, or maybe kind of like work-related values were instilled in you, and a strong sense of like duty and responsibility and having to follow the rules and the norms. I've also noticed in my experience that sometimes planets in the 4th house, and maybe even the ruler of the 4th house, so both of them, can describe the profession of a parent, and how strongly that obviously leaves a very strong kind of like imprint upon our psyche. It's that sort of like subconscious material that we internalize from our parents, from their energy, from whatever they're interested in, that also leaves their mark upon us even if we don't necessarily choose to like follow in their footsteps, because let's face it, how many people do that? Unless you have the ruler of your 4th house in the 10th house, which is a possibility. You may choose to continue with the family business or something of that type. How would you, let me pass the ball on to you. How would you constructively work with a Saturn in the 4th house, Anastasia?
Also, to answer your question about Neptune and sacrifice, for sure. Yeah, like exactly what you mentioned, like leaving friends behind. I lived with my grandparents for a bit. I had to like go to a new place, meeting new people. I think sacrificing a regular childhood experience, because Neptune very much blurs the lines and washes things away. So it's like, you know, where did you grow up? My story of growing up is like 5 pages long. Constructively working with Saturn in the 4th house. I think with Saturn in the 4th, there might be a sense of heavy duty that either to the family or to your spouse, perhaps too, because like 4th house sometimes impacts your family you create. So making sure you're not just handling everything on your own, making sure that you express feelings and you ask for help. I think is important. And do you have any ideas? I think that's probably mine.
I generally say the answer to Saturn is not to run away from Saturn, because Saturn does make us feel like we've got a duty to do something. We might feel like we're not sure about it. Maybe we're feeling like we're not good enough at it. Maybe we have our doubts around it. But I say, bite the bullet, make a commitment, and go ahead and work and achieve whatever Saturn is asking you to achieve. So sometimes Saturn in the 4th house, a constructive use of that would be to acquire property, to kind of like feel like you've worked hard and you've applied yourself, and through your own resources, you've got that tangible sense of material stability connected with the 4th house, which is also property. Are you afraid to create a family of your own? Are you afraid that the family is going to be a burden, or there's going to be too many duties and responsibilities? Again, I'm going back to what you said, Anastasia. Remember that you're not alone in anything, but also the more you avoid it, the more that sense of like inadequacy or feeling like you're not doing something that is important could kind of like follow you a little bit throughout life. And sometimes with Saturn, it's just a case of realizing, okay, this is an area that I have to work for. So let me just apply myself. It might not be fun all the time. It might not be exciting all the time. It is likely to be long lasting, but it's in a way maybe part of your soul's intentions in this lifetime.
Yeah, and taking responsibility for things, right? Like, yes, things in childhood happen to you. You had no choice.
True.
But as a grown-up, you do. You can see those experiences as blessings. You can see the positives in them, because maybe right now you're super self-reliant, right? And super capable and ambitious. I feel like 4th house matters sometimes. If you have like moon connections to those planets can play out as well, right? Like in your chart, it's moon in Capricorn. So there is a little bit of Capricornian energy too, Saturnian energy. So this is just like an extra layer for those of you who know what your moon is doing in the chart. But yeah, taking responsibility. And like you said, Saturn wants you to work with things. Saturn is not afraid of working with things. So be brave.
And have patience also, because things might not move very fast with Saturn. So if you're I actually realized that I have a very good friend. She's a Libra rising. During her Saturn return in Capricorn in the 4th house, she started the process of acquiring a property. I think it took her a long time, also because of the pandemic, because it kind of like happened throughout the pandemic. But she was asking me, it's like, Rux, why is this taking so long? I feel like I've worked so hard and like put so much effort into this, and it's kind of like, where is the end? Is it in sight? And I said, Stefana, my apologies if you're watching this for divulging. It's like, it's gonna be worth it. It's going to feel like one of your biggest achievements. So I'm like, keep at it, keep at it. And indeed, she has managed to kind of like finalize the process, and she has a beautiful home. And in what she has shared with me, she's very proud of her achievement in that regard.
Yeah. Saturn is the master of like hard work, so you're meant to work hard in that part of your chart.
Completely agree. Completely agree.
To quickly mention Uranus in the fourth house, sometimes it means moving a lot, right? Like a lot of changes, perhaps disturbances. And working with Uranus, maybe you accept that for you, home is not a place. Maybe for you, home is something you carry within yourself and have a lifestyle where you live and travel, and it's okay for you. Maybe you bring a lot of tech in your home. Maybe you set like a fancy, I don't know, camera equipment, or just have a house that is fully empty and like, you know, there's no furniture and you sleep on the floor. So like doing something unique. Pluto can create a sense of discomfort in the home, and maybe there's challenging experiences. Of course, not always. Sometimes Pluto just means having parents who are psychotherapists. And I think working with Pluto is like obviously therapy, or helping people who's had similar issues, or also like having a shrine, for example, and like working with it in the home.
I like all of those, and I'm going to add a few examples from what I've noticed with people with these placements in their fourth house. I've also, for whatever reason, seen many times that folks with Uranus in the fourth house can have a step family member, so someone that feels kind of like an outsider, let's call them like a foreigner almost. So someone who kind of like comes into the house and it's like, well, we're kind of related, but only partially. Of course, you are related. So I've seen that with like step parents, step siblings, and so on. Also, a parent that was maybe very inconsistent or very unpredictable. So when you go on to create your own family, if you're feeling like you want to, I don't know, like budge straight away, something's going on and you're like, I need to get out of here. I need to leave the house. Like I can't breathe. Like I don't have space. Maybe it is worth checking whether you have Uranus in your fourth house of home, or aspecting the ruling planet of your fourth house. It would also maybe help if to kind of like settle or work with that Uranian energy, in addition to everything that Anastasia has mentioned, to periodically spend time away from home, or maybe even from family members, so that you feel like you have space, you have kind of like a room to breathe, but you can still go back to your own kind of like home, and maybe afterwards better connect with family members. I've also noticed with Pluto in the fourth house that sometimes there is like a very kind of like powerful magnetic parental figure. So maybe someone who actually holds power over others.
Okay, it only took me 10 minutes.
No problem. There she is, folks. She's back. So I was in the process of like sharing some experiences of people who I know personally with Pluto in the fourth house, and there is actually someone who stuck to my mind. Her father is actually a politician, and there's a lot going on that he can't share. So a lot of like working with confidential information, a lot that kind of like he has to keep very close to his chest. And also with Pluto in the fourth, sometimes maybe there are some kind of like ancestral traumas that kind of like get passed on to from generation to generation, because let's not forget, Pluto is the big the big transformer, the phoenix from the ashes, the death and rebirth planet. In medical astrology, Pluto is allegedly connected, because it hasn't been discovered for that long, let's not forget. It is connected with issues that are DNA related somehow. So there's still kind of like a lot to unpack there. What about Mars in the fourth house, Anastasia? Let's quickly kind of like share a little bit on that before we jump to the eighth house.
Mars in the fourth can bring fighting in the home, right? There could be, well, once again, like if Mars is supported by something, if there is like Mars and Venus in your fourth, maybe your family were all athletes. But if it's just Mars and it's making tough aspects, there might be a lot of negative action, maybe an element of violence in the very like dark manifestation of it. But yeah, I think there might be questions of anger, I think, in the child's life, where whether they are expressed, whether they're not expressed. And working with it, I think you definitely, one thing too with the planets in the fourth house is that they're not seen. They're kind of like below the horizon. So sometimes we may struggle to get access to them. So I think with Mars in the fourth house, you want to make sure you and your family are doing some physical labor together, engaging in some kind of activities, like maybe you build a garden and you work together there, or you have a backyard and you go like throw a ball or have family get together. So like you need to connect with that energy. You need to express it somehow.
I couldn't agree more. And maybe from a soul intention perspective, Mars in the fourth house is asking you to learn to assert yourself at home with family members, people from your family, to maybe reaffirm and reassert your boundaries, to say, hold on a second, no, you can't cross this line. So Mars can also be protection and defense. And as painful as it might be, sometimes we do need to defend ourselves from people that are very close to us. So it's definitely not maybe the easiest placement. There are ways to channel it constructively. I've also noticed with Mars in the fourth house that sometimes there's a parent who works in the military, or in a uniform environment. So that's sort of like the soldier kind of aspect, the warrior aspect of Mars.
Yeah.
So much there.
Eighth house.
let's dig into the eighth house.
So ready?
The eighth house. Yes, other people's resources, taxes, death and rebirth, these kind of like heavy duty stuff, power, the psyche, crisis, but also transformation, alas, coming from someone with the sun in the eighth house, myself, with Mercury in the eighth house and also Saturn in the eighth. I probably do know a little bit about all of the aforementioned. And after all, it's also the house of inheritance, like you mentioned, Anastasia. There's also something that I have felt and encountered in my experience. Of course, the eighth house is sex, but it's more than kind of like enjoyable sex. Maybe it's more about like the power dynamic. Anastasia, correct me if I'm wrong, but in Hellenistic astrology, the fifth house is more about sex, right? It's more about the enjoyment of love.
I studied it when I first learned about it. I used to assign the sex to the eighth house. And right now, the way I view eighth house is more like resources and things that don't belong to us, including our body, including everything that the person shares. I think sometimes people connect sex to it because it's like exchange of energy, but I do think fifth house is more appropriate for sex.
Gotcha.
Unless someone is using it as like a tool to manipulate you and hold something above you.
I see why it is associated with sex, and it's obviously like a traditional versus modern. It's a traditional versus modern approach. I also see why the fifth is associated with it. other people's values and other people's resources. So that's where you learn about what matters to others, what motivates others, what they care about. And sometimes it may feel like that's literally at odds with your value system, because the 8th house opposes the 2nd house, which is your values. So let me share about my experience with my sun in the 8th house. It's very funny because astrology sometimes is super literal. The 8th house is the house of inheritance. The sun can also be the father in our perception. Throughout my entire childhood and even into my adult life, what my father did as one of his major areas of activity, apart from like work and so on, was fighting to win back the lands and the properties that were taken away from his family by the communists in Romania, in the communist regime. So my grandparents from my father's side, they owned some lands. Obviously, that was a bad thing in the communist era. It's like, no, you've got too much land. We're going to divide it to other people. And then my father literally fought for decades. I kid you not. I mean, decades to win it back. And he did, like a big part, like a big chunk of that he did win back. But it was always like a major topic of interest. I remember in my childhood, there was so much revolving, so much conversation, so much energy placed into this topic. I'm like, oh my gosh, like this is so important. And it felt like such a headache. I'm like, I don't want any of this. Like, I don't want to spend my life around this. But of course, I had to learn firsthand about something that people cared about a lot. Interestingly enough, with the sun in the 8th house, you may have, as obviously something that I'm doing as a practicing astrologer, you may have an ability to illuminate other people's resources, to help them understand where their power lies, to maybe help them understand why they act in the way they act, to help them maybe connect at a deeper level with their psyche, with their kind of like hidden or maybe buried or maybe repressed instincts and motivations. It may also feel like other people's resources with the sun there, which is the sense of self, which is our sense of identity, the ego also. It may feel like other people's resources and what you share with others, with your marriage partner, with business partners, that contributes a great deal to how you define yourself. The 8th house is connected with the occult, so there's definitely like a spotlight to the sun placed on maybe topics that are more kind of like hidden, more secretive. I also remember as a child, I was fascinated by the concept of death, and I still am, up until like to this day. I enjoy watching TV shows and reading and like watching YouTube videos about near-death experiences, about like what people say when they go to the other side and they see the tunnel of light. I'm like, oh, this is brilliant. This is absolutely amazing. There can also be a sense of like,
skull. You have the golden skull. Makes sense.
It's all in the natal chart, folks. It's all like astrology is just, this is how it works. This is literally how it works. And there can also be a sense of like constant transformation of the self, or of your sense of self, of your sense of identity. It's like, who am I? Who am I in relation to others? What does having these people and kind of like these maybe energies from other people's lives coming into my life, what does it mean for me and who I am, and what does it mean for my value system, what's important for me? I also have Mercury and Saturn there, so I can ramble about the 8th house until tomorrow. But of course, with Mercury there, obviously there's a tendency to communicate about 8th house topics, and I am obviously doing that as an astrologer. And I feel like I've always had a curiosity to kind of like learn and to understand what happens between people behind closed doors. I remember as a child, I enjoyed kind of like listening into like adults conversations and maybe kind of like sneaking in, and my mom would say, go play with the other children, and I'm like, oh, but the other children are boring. I'm like, I want to listen to you talk about like the juicy stuff, like the real life issues. They say that we also meet the planet placed in a certain house in that particular house. So I'm thinking maybe of an example in that case. Well, the eighth house is also investments, isn't it? So it could be kind of like investing in mercurial businesses. So investing in like an e-commerce business, or investing in like a telecom business. Also, your partner, marriage partner, business partner might have assets in that area. So you might connect with people, Mercury, who you see as being very intelligent, and you're like, I want to use a little bit of that. I want to use a bit of like how your mind works. And with,
yeah, great for collaborations for sure. Any kind of joining forces with other people.
I would say that's been in a way my experience. But at the same time, also I felt like connecting with other people and joining resources has transformed constantly my ways of thinking and my patterns of thinking. It's kind of like opened up maybe new possibilities for me. Saturn in the eighth house. I'm like, what can
long life. Some people say it means long life.
I've yet to actually experience it for myself, but do stay tuned for Written in the Stars episode 5 million when I'm 80 years old.
Shoot for the stars, 120 years old or 180 years old. Who knows what's in the future?
Exactly. I'd say there can be a sense of like duty and responsibility towards other people's money. So some say that this is a good placement for the accountant, for the wealth manager. So the one that kind of like takes care of your investments, of your inheritance, folks who work in finances. I've seen this actually many times. People who have a stellium in the eighth house do seem to somehow kind of like be drawn to the financial system, and they work with the economy, especially if there's like the ruler of the sixth house or the 10th house or the second house of income placed in the eighth house. And Saturn takes everything very seriously, so there is kind of like a sense of like seriousness when it comes to transformation, crisis, what matters to others, what's important for others. Sometimes that can feel like a bit of a burden. Maybe you feel like you're taking it too seriously, and maybe it feels like you're holding yourself back a little bit because you're thinking, oh no, I don't want to kind of like intrude upon other people's resources and maybe misuse them in some shape or form. There's definitely some kind of like more negative descriptions out there on the internet with maybe like Saturn there, or with the sun there, especially with Saturn. I've read that it can feel very hard to access other people's resources. And of course, it may feel like it's not necessarily the easiest thing to do. But at the same time, it could also be because you're probably wanting to do it right, not wanting to make mistakes, not wanting to kind of like waste anyone's time, energy, money, whatever,
right.
Whatever it might be. And I'm going to shut up about my eighth house, because you can tell that I've got a lot going on over there. And I'm just going to end up with like wrap it up with this. I have seen people who are generally interested in anything of a psychological nature have some sort of placement in the eighth house. Anything.
Well, everything you said is really on point, because obviously you have 3 planets there, so you know what you're talking about. I wanted to just talk about like the fact that, you know, second house is our resources, our things, right? And then eighth house is the opposite of that. So it's other people's resources. You can also look at the eighth house as the second from the seventh, and seventh being your partner, second from the seventh, your partner's resources. And it's things we don't own, right? Like, which we talked about in the very beginning, things we have no control over, and it holds debts and taxes and money that we give other people that, you know, sometimes things that are hard to talk about. Like if you owe someone money, you may choose to avoid the topic or until you have the ability to pay them back. It's also always kind of like, you know, will they pay you back? You always take a little bit of a gamble. The important thing, which you already touched on, is eighth house is the inheritance. And so your dad struggled with all of this land and you're going to get it at the end, right? So like he's bringing that land towards you. And of course, Saturn is there for you. So it took a long time, but it's not just the financial inheritance or tangible inheritance. Eighth house also holds, you know, complexes that we may inherit from other people, from our parents, fears, health problems, yeah, like any kinds of difficulties. And another thing, like you said, with planets in the eighth house, you can be, sometimes I feel like people struggle to connect with the eighth house planets, similarly with the 12th, right? Like you may not, I have a friend who has 5 planets in Virgo in the eighth house, and she's like, I'm not a Virgo. And I'm like, you are an accountant. And you are like, you do yoga, so you have all these habits and like you're nitpicky and like everything. She's like a super Virgo. She doesn't see it. She's like, I'm not a Virgo.
In denial.
We may struggle to see it, but I think the energy can come out through like working with other people, collaborating with other people, fighting for the rights of other people. Let's say you have Mars in there, you can be like battling it out for like someone's mental health, right? Like fighting, trying to figure out and fix their fears and like bring the fears to light. Or you have the sun in the 8th, like you're shining light on things that are hard to understand, which I think like 12th house shares that with the 8th. And the transformation, for sure, it's like everything that's in the 8th house calls attention. If you have a debt, you need to pay it off, you need to change it, let it go. If you have a fear, you need to address it, and hopefully, you know, or it may overpower you. So you want to pay attention to things in the 8th, and you want to like learn to bring them up to the surface and let them go.
I'm sighing after talking about the 8th house. I'm like, for those of you who are just listening to this, my apologies for hearing this in the microphone, but alas, that's my reaction. I do want to share some positive kind of like experiences. Of course, I always say there's no such thing as like good or bad. There's pleasant, there's unpleasant, there's challenging, but it's life, right? It's all part of like our life experience. I've seen folks with Jupiter in the 8th house. I can tell you, I have a certain person in mind, but I've seen it many times. Sometimes opportunities can come or doors can open to you via other people's resources. For instance, you connect with someone and you share your business idea with them, and they're like, yeah, I believe in you. Let's do it. Let's work together. I know someone who is literally a dear friend. He's always in some sort of like existential crisis. He's like traveled the world, but he doesn't have like a stable kind of like place. He's like, I don't know what I'm doing with my life. He's been kind of like caught up in between homes and jobs. And he has Jupiter in Aquarius in the 8th house. There's always a friend. I kid you not. There is always a friend who opens a door for him, who offers him like an opportunity, who kind of like helps him solve something. I'm like, man, it's almost like you get into these crises so that you can receive these like opportunities in your life. I'm like, what are you doing with them? You should start channeling that a little bit more consciously, rather than just being like always in a fight or flight kind of like situation where you don't know where you're going to sleep tomorrow. So I have seen that Venus in the 8th house can attract a very generous partner. someone who is very open to kind of like sharing what they have, with you. Venus in the 8th house might also indicate that you enjoy receiving a lot from others, and you have ease in doing that, and that's obviously beautiful. I'd say the moon in the 8th house. Tell me, Anastasia, how do you feel about this placement?
The moon in the 8th. Well, the moon in the 8th can have, like, on the negative, you know, there might be like certain difficulties with the mother, because 8th house is the place that's highly unpredictable. So sometimes the mother may have had to deal with certain difficulty. But the moon is moon sort of can find comfort in any house. It may struggle for a little bit, but I think the people with the moon in the 8th are highly intuitive, and they have that ability to pick up on the vibes and the moods of other people. So using that intuition to do tarot or magic or anything esoteric, I think can be a lovely tool. Definitely, I think intangible things, or like murder mysteries or any kind of detective novels, can be like a great source of joy for people with the moon in the 8th. And they may be either the issues. I think the question of like being supported by other people a lot could be a question for them, and it may flip flop. I think sometimes they may be the source of support for other people. Yeah.
I like that. And I love the mystery, the mystery and like the detective side to it. There's definitely like a very inquisitive side to the 8th house for me. And especially with the moon, it feels like it's something kind of like instinctive. It's like you're all of a sudden in the middle of like someone's kind of like behind the scenes like drama, and you discover their secrets, and you're like, what do I do with these? I've also seen people with the moon in the 8th house tell me that others come to them in times of crisis because they feel safe with them. They make others kind of like feel heard and listened to, and in a good place emotionally in times of like transition, desperate needs, and so on. The good old 8th house. I love it when you said that it requires our attention. It requires us to connect with it, and in a way we can't figure it out on our own almost. Tell me.
Yeah, because it's the place of other people's resources. So a lot of times you need the help of a friend or a therapist in order to unlock that. To connect
with that. And of course, like when you're in a relationship, especially in a committed relationship, there's a lot of hidden material, a lot of your family inheritance, emotional, spiritual, that kind of like comes to the surface. Like you kind of like get to see a side of you that maybe you buried in somewhere deep in your subconscious, and it kind of like came up in a relationship, but before that there was no need to access it, or there was no kind of like propitious set of circumstances to bring that up to the surface.
And going with that too, like you see it in relationships, and you also see it through your partner. Sometimes planets in the 8th and transits in the 8th can be literally things happening in the life of the partner. Like, you know, it could be gains, like you talked about, gains from like people gift you things, or like your friend always gets things, but it can also mean that like your partner inherits something and you benefit through them receiving. Yeah, like gains through death sometimes comes with the 8th house, and gains by getting into debt, but only if you have positive planets. Like if you have Venus or Jupiter in the 8th house, you may go into debt and you may make money. You know, buy an apartment and then the rates go down, you sell it, make more money. Not so much if you have Mars or Saturn in the 8th house. I have a friend who has Mars in the 8th. Anytime she took any risks financially, it's not great for her. So you really want to be careful.
It didn't pay off. Yeah. So definitely we would kind of like advise to be a little bit more cautious with maybe Mars there, with Saturn there. Maybe if it's an exalted Mars, a Mars in Capricorn, maybe it's a little bit kind of like it works a little bit better. Or maybe if it's forming some harmonious aspects with like a benefic, possibly it could turn out better. but do be careful if you can. So in a nutshell, if you've got a more kind of like challenging possibly placement in your 8th house, such as Mars or maybe even Saturn there, it is worth looking at whether it's in a placement where it has some dignity. So maybe it's Mars in Capricorn, or maybe it's receiving an aspect from Jupiter, from Venus. So there's ways to work around also the more kind of like challenging placements, but do be a little bit more cautious. Let's say we definitely advise more caution with Mars in the 8th rather than with Venus there, or with Jupiter there. Let's put it this way. Or maybe you can kind of like find a very, I don't know, like a very reliable like sports team to like bet on. But still, we're not financial advisors, so you're responsible for all your financial choices.
Yeah, be rational.
Exactly.
As a Virgo, I will always advise you to keep one foot on the ground.
100%. And as a moon in Capricorn, I would always say, don't move too fast. Do you have a backup plan? What if this fails? Don't bet money or don't invest money that you need to in order to survive, in order to kind of like keep a roof over your head. Alas, yes. That's our own chart speaking in consultations. Let's say.
Yeah, you want to have some earth if you're making important financial decisions. At least, get someone who has some earth and hold on to them to like get a little bit of their energy.
Something to ground you. What would you do, Anastasia, with a Pluto or a Neptune in the 8th house?
Neptune can be tricky when it comes to resources. I always advise people who have Neptune in the 8th house to get like a prenup, or to make sure that they discuss everything when it comes to who owes what, and like making sure you're not just like signing off everything. I actually have seen it in my clients where someone was married and she has Neptune in her 8th house, and like they struggled to figure out or he wasn't making any money. Sometimes finances can be very fuzzy, so you want to make sure you're clarifying things before you dive in.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Sorry, what were you gonna say?
I agree with that. I really agree. I really agree with that. Yes.
And Pluto can signify a little bit of an obsession with death. It can bring challenging experiences connected to death. Just sort of like a sense of familiarity and closeness to it, but also perhaps even stronger psychic talents, maybe ability to connect with the dead, know more what's happening underneath, because 8th house is already like a hidden dark house. Things that are happening in there are not obvious. So I think Pluto has a bit of a natural affinity to the 8th house. There might be secrets though. There might be like secrets in the family or in the relationship around taxes, shared property, debts, or anything like that.
It's interesting. It's interesting you say that. I have seen in a few people's lives that there was an experience of bankruptcy in the family. And not just for the parents, it didn't have to be the parents' person. It was sometimes with grandparents. Like there was kind of like an experience of like ancestors, maybe assets kind of like being taken away from them somehow, and that was like a very like traumatic thing that got carried through the ancestral lineage. So it left a very powerful imprint upon them. And as a transpersonal planet, this is what I've generally found. It may feel sometimes that with transpersonal planets, Pluto, Neptune, Uranus, it may feel like a lot of circumstances outside of our field of vision, outside of our control, that we could not have prevented, predicted, or kind of like dealt with in a mature or like responsible or self-sufficient manner. It may feel like these types of circumstances that feel fated have a very powerful impact upon our lives. So I don't know, it could be Pluto in the 8th house, a very powerful transformation, almost like a death and rebirth experience through other people's assets. So in a best case scenario, maybe someone decides to invest in your startup and you become a millionaire, or someone decides to fund your studies to give you a scholarship and your life is completely changed. In a worst case scenario, it obviously depends. The entire chart must kind of like show additional indicators in this direction. In a worst case scenario, it may feel like you lose assets or you lose everything you have because your partner kind of like throws them out the window, or maybe has some sort of like dark secret, he gambles or something of that type. And it's like, oh, like how could I have predicted this? I didn't even know it was happening. It was a secret, right?
Yeah. And of course, it depends on if there are other planets in your 8th house, what is the ruler of your 8th house is doing. If your 8th house is like Pisces and your Jupiter is in Sagittarius, you don't have to worry about that, right? Like you have good promise.
It's a lot. It's definitely a lot easier. It's something that you can probably rely upon. And yes, always check the rulers. Folks, check the rulers of each of these houses, because these can give you some additional indicators as to what to expect in this area, maybe what other life sectors are linked with this particular area of your life. So it can kind of like tell you, why is this happening here with like other people's resources? And let's say you've got, I don't know, the ruler of the 8th house in the 11th house. So maybe you have to, in order to work with it more constructively with other people's resources, you have to set some kind of like clear goals and objectives for the future. Maybe there needs to be some extra clarity on that front. So always look at how the various different life sectors in your life are linked, and that's where rulers are super, super helpful.
Yeah. Shall we talk about the
12th house? Bam. Hit me, Anastasia, because you have all of it there. Tell me.
I have all of it there. I have Sun, Venus, and Mars. So a lot of experience. I'm there a lot. It's part of my life, part of the territory I occupy a lot. So 12th house, I was actually listening to the Astrology podcast, and they were offering like a very interesting perspective on it. So I'm going to share some of that. But 12th house is the house that would have been on the ascendant as the mother was in child labor. So that house is rising as the mother is about to give birth, right? So she gives birth and like the next sign kind of rises and you're on the ascendant, or basically everything that is in the 12th house is the child labor. So it has that quality. It's like an in-between house, and it's the house that carries certain pain with it and certain losses, because like, you know, literally when the birth happens, the child is going through a birth canal. It's a painful process, traumatic process. And there is a transformation of sorts, like you're going from the comfort of your mother's womb into the world. So the house is a bit of like between life and death. And it's also, childbirth is a very dangerous process, right? Like not everyone made it back in the day. So the 12th house, even right now, it's still dangerous for everyone. So it has a bit of that quality of like hard labor. In traditional astrology, it's been called like the house of bad spirit. So a lot of times you have to deal with self-undoing things in that house. There might be self-sabotage, like if you have your sun in the 12th house, maybe you doubt your own light. Maybe every time you get an opportunity to present an idea or to be the center of attention, you shy away from it. If you have Venus there, right, like maybe you doubt yourself as a partner. Maybe every time there is an idea of a relationship, you get like an anxiety attack and you run away from it. So speaking about a friend, so talking about a friend.
Anastasia does not have Venus in her 12th house, folks, in case you're wondering. She's just
No, I do.
I know that's kind of like my not such great sarcasm.
You're trying to like divert the attention. Like, yeah, so there's a sense of, a lot of times when you have planets in the 12th house, your early life, or there may have been challenging things, there may have been losses connected to the 12th house. And the planets that are in the 12th, they rule certain houses in your chart. So whichever houses they rule, that's where you may see some of those tough experiences. And like, for example, my sun is in the 12th house, and my 11th house is Leo, so it's ruled by the sun.
Mm-hmm.
And I have gone through plenty of relationship transformations, friendship transformations. You know, people are in my life, then they're out of my life. And at some point you sort of start to learn that people who are meant to stay, and people who aren't meant to stay, just let them go. It's the place of isolation. It's the place of being alone with your thoughts, and people who have planets in the 12th need alone time, as you can probably confirm, as well as both 8th house and 12th house individual.
Agree.
Yeah, so like you need to spend some time alone to get in touch with yourself, to connect with yourself. And in that place of being alone, like you may be alone because you're struggling with a mental health issue, or you may be alone as a way of connecting with yourself. New York sounds. I know. New York is reminding us about its existence. So you have two paths in the 12th house. You can go down the road of self-undoing. You can fall a victim to those energies. You can doubt yourself. You can use the past experiences as the weapons against yourself, or you can choose to transcend them and work with them, and not drink when you have frustrated like sadness, but instead like sit with your own thoughts, talk to a therapist, go and spend some time alone. And maybe another beauty of the 12th house is like it's the realm of isolation and challenging experiences and invisible things, so you can be a fighter for those things. Like, my sun is in the 12th house, so is my Venus and Mars, and I talk about astrology. I shine light on things that are not seen. Like you cannot really, you can sort of see the sun, right, and planets in the night sky, but yeah, like you can choose the energy, you can choose to shine it on tough things and work with those experiences. For example, Gandhi and Dalai Lama both have their sun in the 12th house, and they have both chosen a life path of like serving and helping other people.
That's beautiful, and thank you for sharing. And I have read and I have seen that a lot of politicians also have the sun in the 12th house. So it's kind of like giving themselves, I know some people might raise their eyebrows and say, what are you talking about, Rex? But there's almost like putting themselves and putting their sense of self and identity into the service of others, where you partially lose part of your identity, because you're, as a politician, at least on paper, you are technically meant to be in the service of others. The 12th house is also connected with charity. I read somewhere that in the 12th house we pay the debt for life. So it's almost like we give selflessly. No one asks us, do you want to give this away? Do you want to surrender this part of your life? It's like, no one asked me, like, hello, I didn't receive a note. So one other way to kind of like constructively work with this, as you mentioned, Anastasia, is maybe to serve indeed a cause that is linked with the collective, to do some volunteering, to kind of like maybe help those who are suffering, who aren't maybe seen by society, who are somehow at the kind of like margins of society in some form or another, maybe because they're struggling with mental health, maybe because they're placed in some sort of institution. 12th house has also some sort of connection with institutions, hospitals, prisons, also you could say libraries. So institutional institutional kind of circumstances.
Yeah, and places of quiet, places where like you go and you are alone and isolated, right? Prison, hospital, library. Like you're not gonna have a party in the library.
Exactly. And it does feel like, yes, I love that. It does feel like you don't really have a party with the planets in the 12th house, but there is maybe a lot of calmness and serenity to be gained out of those if you access consciously those planets, if and only if you don't judge yourself for whatever those planetary energies represent in your life, because many times the 12th house is also connected with guilt. Maybe as a child with Mars there, speaking for a friend again, I've got Mars in Gemini in my 12th house. Maybe as a child, you were not encouraged to be assertive or to express your anger or to draw your boundaries. Maybe you were made to feel like being angry is something bad, so you should just kind of like keep it together and save it for when you're at home on your own, so you can kind of like shout out the window and just not do it in front of someone else. So I do believe
as a Mars in the 12th house native too, every time I had a problem, my parents' response was like, well, but what did you do to cause it? What did you do to like be the result of this person's unfair action towards you? So that's very much like Mars in the 12th house.
That is so interesting. That is so interesting. I mean, you can tell that we're both a little bit like, why did we have to deal with Mars this way? Obviously, let's not forget, folks, Mars can be angry. Mars can be angry, but Mars is also motivated. Mars does something about things. And well, of course, with Mars in the 12th, I would generally kind of recommend putting some sort of energy into 12th house matters. It depends obviously on the sign placement of Mars. So for instance, in my case, Mars is in Gemini. So I do feel that for a big part of my life, I have put energy into 12th house matters, such as studying astrology, studying what happens between kind of like that realm between worlds. I've been very motivated to do that and felt also very energized after having acquired knowledge in that realm. I keep on saying to people that one of the probably most exciting, uplifting, and energizing experiences that I've had in my life have been the sessions of past life regression that I've done in my life. I've loved connecting with my previous a few of my previous incarnations. Of course, for those of you who resonate with this idea and with this belief, if it is something that that kind of like draws your attention, I would highly recommend it. It's not for everyone, but it can be very perspective altering, and it can give a sense of closure maybe as to why you've experienced in this lifetime certain patterns that you can't explain. You're looking at your family, you're like, it's not coming from my family. Where is this coming from? So I do feel like it can be a very healing experience to kind of like go in between worlds. I've also recommended like shamanic ceremonies to people who have planets in the 12th house, again, because it may feel like something beyond your own individual life. Something out there is influencing whatever is going on in your life, and whatever those planetary energies represent for you. It's also a house of surrendering.
You can escape the world by drinking, or you can become an ayahuasca shaman. Yes
to that, folks. Choose your escapism. Choose how you surrender. The 12th house is connected with addiction also, and I have seen it many times in my practice, in my experience. Not necessarily for the individual themselves. Maybe they've experienced it in their family history. They've witnessed it, but in some form or another, it impacted their life as well. sometimes there's guilt associated with that, especially when there's kind of like a history of addiction in the family. Maybe the child growing up sees the parent kind of like going through a tough time, maybe drinking or something like that, and wonders, am I guilty? Have I done anything to make my dad do that? It could be a genuine question that the child asks themselves.
Yeah, and planets in the 12th house rule other houses. So sometimes if the planet in the 12th rules your 7th, your house of marriage, maybe your partner has a little bit of the 12th energy. Maybe they are a very spiritual person, or maybe they've dealt with some issues connected to, you know, alcohol abuse. I dated someone with a ruler of the 12th house, of the 7th and the 12th. I dated a person who was like a recovering alcoholic, like 7 years sober or something like that. So very literal manifestation of the 12th house. Also wanted to talk about the losses of the 12th house and how sometimes you can almost like expect them in a way, or you can start giving things up. Like you can initiate things that you're letting go, right? Like if you have Venus in the 12th house, maybe you choose to live a lifestyle without sugar, or maybe you try not to get too much like clothes, for example, and you choose a lifestyle that's a little bit more spiritually oriented versus material gains oriented.
I love that, and I think that's one of my favorite methods of remediation for challenging placements in the natal chart. It's what we call symbolic substitution. So you could think of each of the planetary energies in your chart as kind of like asking you to channel them, asking you to do something with them. So you can choose to do it consciously, or you can have them happen to you. So I do believe that what Anastasia said with Venus in the 12th, give up on sugar, or maybe give up on something, or maybe donate some of your clothes, donate some of the things that you're attached to and that brought you a lot of beauty and a lot of joy in your life. Maybe with Mercury in the 12th house, you can kind of like save some time, save some hours in your week, in your month, to do some volunteering in teaching children. You could say with Jupiter in the 12th house, the first thing that came to mind was maybe it's worth kind of like spending some time in an institutional kind of like environment, again, maybe working in a hospital, or doing some volunteering there, or kind of like giving selflessly some of your positivity, optimism, and wisdom to others, kind of like sharing that without necessarily expecting anything in return. And I think that's the key with 12th house placements, right? Maybe not expecting something in return, but realizing that we're probably creating good karma for ourselves, just saying.
Yeah, and self-undoing, like what you were talking about with politicians, like self-undoing can be negative, or it could be the undoing of the self, the letting go of the ego. You're letting go of your attachments. And of course, it's really hard, right? Like as a person with three planets in the 12th house and being a Libra rising, like you talk to me about giving up some of my dresses and I want to cry. I'm just like, but why? But they're mine. Like, I know, I love them. But definitely, and like what you talked about, volunteer work, I actually have a client with Mars and Jupiter and Libra in the 12th house, and she's done a ton of volunteer work. And I think it's been really lovely for like her karma. And I can see her karma is clear and beautiful. If you have Mars in the 12th house, you can donate some money to like military people, veterans, for example, or you can donate some of your time and energy, maybe volunteer with them. And you know, like Moon, if your mom had any issues, because another thing that's 12th house is not always, I mean, I mentioned that it's not just you, right? Like if it's your sun or your moon, it means your parents. So maybe like my son is conjunct Venus and Mars, and my dad was very much, you know, the reason why I traveled a lot, which like 12th house deals with travel too, being isolated. And he was in the military, conjunct Mars, and he was a Libra sun, so conjunct Venus. It's my 12th house is also very much my father. I can't remember where I was going with this. But
you were saying that it doesn't necessarily have to be just you and kind of like your experiences. It can be what others bring into your life, and somehow it influences your experience as well.
Right. But whatever energies in your 12th house, just assume that maybe those planets struggle to come out in you a little bit, and whatever work you can do to bring them out. Like, we both have Mars in the 12th house working out a lot, right? Like taking up some kind of martial arts class.
Yes.
Venus, present your work more. I don't know, go on relationship, go on dates, dress up, like do things that maybe are outside of your comfort zone, but you're still like trying to access that energy.
Folks, it's the 12th house. It's like sometimes we're just tired in the 12th house, and we just need to let go, and and rest. Anastasia, this was amazing. I want to thank you for coming here today and for sharing your experience and your knowledge and your expertise with us. Hopefully we shall do this again soon. Is there anything else that you would like to share before we wrap up? And hopefully we've given some good ideas to folks who are maybe struggling with some of their placements in these houses.
Yeah, last thing I wanted to just kind of like mention about the 12th house is, like, if you're having difficulties, allow yourself alone time. Just know that you're meant to spend time alone, and that is actually your remedy and your pill. So go outside, be in the nature, because there's a struggle seeing yourself, and you sometimes see yourself more by separating. And yeah, thank you so much for having me. I definitely hope that we'll do this again. Let us know, people watching, let us know if you have any questions, any comments. Do you have any planets in those houses? And yeah, I think that's it. Thank you again.
It was a pleasure. And folks, don't forget to follow Anastasia. So she's on Instagram, on YouTube, and on TikTok. Anastasia does astrology. That's where you can find her. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for listening to us today. And yes, please do share your experiences. As I say, we might not respond to all comments, but we definitely read them. And I also think it's very helpful for others to see and to relate to how others have lived out some of their more challenging placements in their chart. And if you haven't,
nothing is a verdict.
Nothing is a verdict. Exactly. Yeah. There's lighter and there's darker kind of like expressions of each placement of each maybe natal signature. And don't forget that you're a co-creator of your reality ultimately. Yeah, we share that view. We're both optimists, and we believe that anything can be worked on. I agree. If you haven't subscribed yet, folks, what are you waiting for? You can also find me on Instagram. My Instagram handle is @RUXUnbelievable, and I shall see you next time. Thank you. Bye.